Elder Barawak presents Nazarene Hebrew Institute of Technology.
Family all around me. Family all around me. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. We are family. We might have the same last name, but that don't make you my family. I got some people with the same blood, and I know that they can't stand me. I got some people I call that ain't kin, that's gonna pull up and handle it. They take care of that business like family. We come from them trenches like family. They talking, you listen, that's family. They don't tell your business, that's family. They calling your phone, coming looking for you. They say that you missing, that's family. They don't need permission, that's family. When you hurt, they can feel it, that's family. Let them come while you cheering, that's family. Let them come when you living, that's family. Family all around me. Hey, family all around me. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. We are family all around me. Hey, family all around me. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. We are family. Hey, ain't nobody fighting around here. Ain't nobody shooting around here. Everybody that's around here, family. All love, no hate, be clear. No shade, all love, be real. You love them, you know how it feel. Tired of all these badass kids. Tired of paying all these bills. Family going through the same thing, so they know exactly how you feel. They supply a shoulder I can cry. I provide a place where they can heal. Leave my money out, they don't steal. Let them have it if it's for a bill. Soldier for me when they in the field. Only way I live, family all around me. Hey, family all around me. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. We are family all around me. Hey, family all around me. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. He my family, she my family. We are family. We might have the same last name, but that don't make you my family. I got some people with the same blood, and I know that they can't stand me. I got some people I call that ain't kin, that's gonna pull up and handle it. They take care of that business like family. We come from them trenches like family. Family all around me.
All right, family. This is Nazarene Hebrew Institute of Technology. We're not affiliated with any camps or hate groups. We have a special guest on again, Mr. Professor Tudor Parfitt. He is a scholar of Jewish studies and anthropologist, ethnogenist, and various other things. If you don't know who he is, please Google him. We interviewed him several months ago, and he's going to be doing a presentation. I suggest you guys take notes and pen and paper. He's going to be speaking about a variety of things dealing with Jews, Black Jews, and also with lemba and other particular type of Jews. I'm so excited because I've read all his books. I don't think I read the last one, but we'll talk about the name of his books towards the end so you guys can put in order to get his books. I've interviewed several of his students. Y'all have seen several of his students on here. I did have one planned, Miss Edith Bruder, but she had got sick and she had to postpone. And I'm looking forward to her coming on. But Tudor Parfitt has been a real knowledgeable scholar in my life, and that I've researched a lot of stuff that he has presented. And I've been watching him for over a decade or so and a half, maybe longer than that. And I'm happy to have you here, Mr. Parfitt. Welcome. Do you got anything to say before we get started?
Okay, well, very nice to be here, Elder Barawak, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'll make a presentation about some of the issues surrounding the idea that, let's say, African Americans originate as Jews, or that there may have been some Jewish element in Africans as they crossed in the slave ships on the Middle Passage, and various other issues which have arisen from my work. Now, I've got some slides, and so I just want to be sure that everybody can see the screen.
Okay, you guys type a 1 in the chat if you guys can see the screen, please. We need to be focused on this, family. He's going to put out some valuable information. So type a 1 in the chat if everybody can see the screen, please.
So is that visible?
Yes, they're typing a 1, yes.
Very
yes.
good. So, you know, a lot of African Americans ask me this question. Is there any possibility, they ask, that the Black people who arrived in the United States or in the Caribbean or in Brazil or anywhere else might have been Jewish? And as I start talking today, I'm going to turn that question a bit on its head, because over the period of transatlantic slavery, which reached its peak around the year 1800, there was an increasing certainty that all Jews, and here we're not talking about the slave population, but all Jews living in Europe were not white at all, but were Black. Now, that may not be your kind of take on it, but that was this was the feeling at the time. And so particularly as we get to the middle of the 19th century, with the American Civil War and the incredible prominence of the question of slavery in the minds of everybody, and also during the period of the European scramble for Africa. Remember that until the end of the 19th century, most of Africa was not colonized. It was independent, and by the end of the century that changed. And just about every single country in Africa came under colonial rule, with the exception of Ethiopia. And so during this period, there was an enormous amount of racialization. racialization wasn't really a thing before the Enlightenment. This is the great flowering of knowledge during the 18th century in Western Europe, and which, of course, passed also to the young United States in due course. And during this period, the idea of race was born. You could say that before the end of the 17th century, there simply was no real notion of race at all. There was one French doctor by the name of Bernier who studied briefly in at the University of Montpellier in the south of France, and then went on a long journey to India. And in India, he worked as the private physician of the Mughal, the emperor of India, Muslim, colored gentleman. And he spent some 7 years there, and then he came back via Aden. He went to Iran, he went all over the place. He met slaves coming over from Africa to Mocha on the Red Sea. He examined them very precisely. And when he came back to France after his long journey, he had a novel idea which he wrote in the first academic journal ever, which was produced in Paris. It was called the Journal des Savants, the journal of scholars. And in it, he was slightly tongue-in-cheek in a way, but he wrote an article which basically was called A New Division of the World. And what he proposed as a new division of the world was that instead of thinking of the world divided into religious groups or divided into empires or divided into kingdoms, we should think of the world divided into races. And you come to this conclusion because studying men and women, and particularly women, on his long journey, he noticed that they look different, and that he thought that this difference in look was of huge importance. And nobody kind of thought of that before, you know. They thought in terms of, well, yeah, you know, kingdoms, religious differences, and all of these things. But the idea that the look of a man's face was of any particular significance in group terms was not really current. And during that period, before Bernier, we have some very, very interesting accounts of Africa and of Africans. Not much was known about Africans, and it's true that some of the designations, some of the descriptions are quite negative, and but not all. And so, I mean, I can remember reading one which was very remarkable, and it talked about a British journey, you know, a journey down the west coast of Africa, as the coast of Africa was being discovered by Europe. It wasn't known, you know, before the 17th century. It really wasn't. And this ship's captain goes down, and he stops at a point which is pretty far north off the coast of Morocco. And they go ashore, and they look at the Arabs who live there. They're quite dark-coloured, and he wasn't at all impressed. You know, you think, these scrawny people, they're skinny little people. They're not going to, you know, they're not much good for anything. And then he carries on with his journey, and then, you know, they get to a point of, you know, where sort of Black Africa proper happens, somewhere around what today would be Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. And they go ashore, and they see these very big, well-muscled men with gleaming teeth, and who look as if they could look after themselves pretty well. And he's full of admiration. He said, "My God, the difference between these people and those skinny Arabs is really quite something. These are magnificent people. The sun seems to shine from their face, and they're strong, and they're handsome, and they're beautiful, and so on and so forth." So, this was a not uncommon view among Europeans going back to the pre-Enlightenment period. And during the Enlightenment, everything changes because of the invention of race. Now, why would it change? It changed to some extent because, the idea was that race was important. Everybody had a kind of racial category, and that this racial category was kind of pyramid shaped. And the idea was that, white people are right at the top of this thing. And eventually it became the case that, that black people were at the bottom. There was no particular reason for this other than, I suppose, the state of development by and large in black Africa was not equivalent to Europe, although, of course, there were many African societies which, even at that point in the 17th century, were very sophisticated. And even before, we think of the centralized state in Zimbabwe, the great Zimbabwe ruins, we think of Ghana, we think of many, and indeed Luanga with its centralized state and its sophisticated society, its sophisticated industries and organization, and so on. But still, the way they thought about it was, well, they're mostly living grass huts, and they've got spears. We already have got guns, and we live in stone houses, and these people are at a lower level of development, and so that they were put at the bottom of this kind of tree of the races. So it became the case that to be called a Negro became not a term of admiration, but a term of vilification. And it's at this point, primarily, that the idea that all Jews were black, which became an extraordinarily powerful sentiment and belief from the beginning of the 19th century right through to the Nazi period. So, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books and articles written explaining that that Negro blood somehow got into Jewish blood at a very, very, very early stage, and many people took it back to the time of Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea. So, there was intermarriage, according to this theory, between the Jews and Africans, and this explained the color of Jews, it explained the personality of the Jews, and it explained the behavior of the Jews. So, I mean, this was a really kind of interesting point. It was the Africanization of Jews. Now, I know that African Americans who believe in the Hebrew theory don't ever really think about this. However, this is an absolutely genuine description of European thought a couple of hundred years ago, reaching back to very, very ancient times. Believing that all of the Jews knocking around in the world originally were descended from what they then called, which we would no longer use the word, but what they called Negro population. So, in other words, a good deal of the Jewish population started off as black Africans. So this then creates a conflation. So there was no distinction made between one category and the next. The conflation of Jew and Negro was constructed on the earlier foundations of centuries of writing and thought, detailing the inseparable links between Jews and Negroes and their unique position in the world as people quite apart from the generality of humankind. It was constructed on the occasional medieval conviction that Jews were black and on the more recent obsession with the notion of Jews of color throughout the world. This conflation was thus the culmination of an ancient historical and racial theory and produced the fusion of two ancient streams of hate, the hatred of Jews and the European hatred of blacks in the post-Enlightenment times and even before. It's the fusion of these hatreds which did so much to radicalize feelings about Jews and blacks over the following years. And of course, it acted as a justification, among other things, for the continuing slave trade. Now, there's one very sinister character, Mr. Robert Knox, or Dr. Robert Knox, who lived in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and he was one of the most radical physical anthropologists, and he argued very, very unambiguously in the 1820s, 1830s, that Jews were of Negro origin, and his thinking was set out in races of men, and this has to be viewed against the backdrop of the fight for the political emancipation of British Jews, which Knox opposed, but which, when he was writing his book, was well on the way to being won. So he didn't want Jews to have the vote in Great Britain. He was convinced of the superiority of the British, and the proof of the superiority of the British was the fact that by this time they controlled about 25% of the surface of the world, which Britain had sovereignty over at that time, and another 25% of the surface of the world over which Britain had indirect control, not quite sovereignty, but total and absolute control. It therefore followed that if Britain controlled at least half of the world in every conceivable way, that there was something pretty superior about the British. And as they were so superior, it didn't make any sense for other people to be involved in decision making at the heart of the Great British Empire. So, according to Knox, Jews were African and Asiatic. They're not European. And the purest of the Jewish race is dark, tawny, yellow-colored person with jet black hair and eyes seemingly colored. There's no mistaking the race when pure. It's Egyptian, which is to say African, a series of incorrect observations commencing with Blumenbach, who was one of the great racial theorists, but not terminating with Pritchard, who's another great racial theorist, has led to errors which no doubt will hold their ground for centuries to come. So you have this idea then that the Jews are all Jews. All Jews have got black blood. They're dark-skinned. In many cases, they're fully black, and they have African behaviors, and to all intents and purposes, they are simply black. And in the same way that in days before multiculturalism in Europe, on the one hand, you've got what was considered to be a higher culture in terms of music, things like Mozart and Beethoven, all of these things. And on the other hand, what was then considered, but which is no longer considered, to be the primitivism of Africa. And the Jews as well are put into this primitivist bracket, and anything Jewish was seen to be a kind of development of African primitivism. And so I'll give you a couple of examples coming into the 20th century and thinking about both white supremacists in the United States and also, let us say, Nazis or National Socialists and other racists on the European continent, where the Jews were very, very much criticized for jazz. The idea was that, you have a pure and you have a noble kind of European culture, which is the product of a pure and unadulterated European race. That's on one hand. And then you have new, different kinds of culture, which are not pure and which are the product of a much inferior race. And they pointed at this point to Africans and to Jews. And so jazz was a prime example of what was considered to be decadent culture. And the fact that, during the Harlem Renaissance and periods like this, with the great efflorescence, the flowering of jazz and African musical forms, and then later swing, great sort of novel, boundary shifting musical developments. The Nazis and white supremacists considered these to be decadent and useless. And the Jews who participated in lots of ways in the jazz revolution as producers, as makers of musical sheets, owners of jazz clubs, all of these things, there seemed to be a kind of a cooperation between Jews and blacks in the production of this decadent, as it was thought, music. Which was considered both decadent and primitive. So, going back to the British Empire, in 1895, Joseph Chamberlain, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, refuted the idea of climatic determinism and pinned his flag to the mast of racial immutability by declaring that this Anglo-Saxon race, so proud, tenacious, self-confident and determined, this race which neither climate nor change can degenerate, will infallibly be the predominant force of future history and universal civilization. So that kind of is a good example of what I was saying earlier. You've got this idea of, the enormous success of the English-speaking peoples. And if you look at the map, it doesn't even include the United States. You've got, you've got Canada up there, dear old Greenland. Well, that wasn't part of the deal at that time. But then you've got the United States here, which also kind of went along these lines. And then you've got a whole kind of string of British colonies going right across Africa. It was called the it was called the Cairo to Cape Railway, which was which required a contiguous swathe of British territory, and there are plenty of other bits of Africa which were also under indirect British control. India, of course, Australia, New Zealand, all of these places, were all part of this empire, which sort of underlined the kind of racial superiority of the English. And it just, if you look at the map, when the Germans come along a little bit later, and they're very, very resentful over the fact that, that the British and the French and the Portuguese, they've all got big sort of African colonies, and they want to have some, and they get this little bit here. They have Tanganyika over here, which went to the new German Empire after 1870, and then they decide during the period of Hitler that Germany, which is kind of there, is not nearly big enough for the great German Empire of the future, and they decide that they need to expand in this direction and have a great empire here to as a kind of balance to European empires in Africa and India and everything else. And that, of course, leads to the Second World War. And they elaborate a theory of race, which was not very different, really, from the British theory of race that Joseph Chamberlain talks about. It's actually pretty identical, which basically argues that it's the people up here in Scandinavia, blue-eyed, blonde-haired people, in Britain to an extent, but Holland, Belgium somewhat, but mainly kind of Germany. These were the real masters of the world, and all other races were subservient to them and should be. So you have one racial kind of theory which was put about by the British and also the Americans, followed by another racial theory which was almost exactly the same, which really left its mark on the world in an incredible way and led to the subjugation of black people throughout the world long after their legal theoretical emancipation. So part of the idea of these racial theories, as you would imagine, was that the Germans and the English at the top of the kind of racial pole were beautiful, and people further down the pole were not. And one of the great theorists of ugliness was a chap called Christoph Meiners. He was a polygynist German historian and professor at one of the great German universities, and he's considered to be one of the founders of scientific racism. And he had an enormous influence on all of the great 19th century race scientists, so-called, and including Robert Knox and all of the rest. And so basically he posited an overarching kind of division of humankind into categories of beautifulness. And this was taken up by the Nazis later on, and by white supremacists in the United States. And the basic argument was that Jews and blacks, once again, were conjoined in this incredible theory with ugliness. They were both ugly peoples, according to this theory. And the way, I mean, it's very easy to kind of, develop such an idea. What you do is you find the most beautiful white person that you can find, and you compare him with her with the ugliest African or Jew you can find, and of course it's not a fair comparison in any way. If you did it the other way around and compared a very, very beautiful black person with an extremely ugly, German or English or Scandinavian person, then you could argue obviously the opposite. And so here, Der Stürmer is the very, very famous Nazi racist rag. It was so racist it was almost embarrassing even to the Nazis. And it was always full of, these hideous caricatures of Jews, often, presented as kind of black looking, and you see this Jew here is also supposed to have sort of somewhat black features. Here you've got, the idea of, do you see, this is a very interesting one. I know, as you've suffered living in the United States, and you know all about, I mean, for instance, in Florida, where I'm sitting, we had a program last week about Rosewood, the African, quite affluent African town in Florida, which was destroyed and where people were killed and raped, and it was just the most awful situation. And the underlying problem, and it's still the case today, for white supremacists of the, such as, the Ku Klux Klan and other organizations, is that blacks are sexually dangerous. And the great fear was that white women were going to get seduced or raped by blacks, and the very, very slightest suggestion that anything, might happen between a black at the beginning of the last century led to the most awful attacks and unjudicial killings of black people throughout the United States. And Jews were similarly thought in Germany, but also in the United States by white supremacists as being similarly dangerous people. You wouldn't trust your women to be anywhere near them. And you see this interesting illustration here in Der Stürmer on the left-hand side of that cartoon. You see a sinister-looking black person looking with great and sexual interest at this blonde white woman, and you've got a Jew on the other side doing exactly the same thing. And I have collected hundreds of cartoons along those lines. And if you get if you get the book, my last book, which was published by Oxford University Press, it's called Hybrid Hate, and there are a lot of illustrations in that book showing precisely this sort of thing. So on the one hand, you've got ugly Jews and dangerous Jews, sexually threatening Jews and blacks, and then of course you've got ugly blacks as well. I mean, some of the descriptions of blacks are absolutely horrific. One here by miners, they had a frightful tiger-like, hardly human look. Their teeth locked together like the bite of a fox. They so loved human flesh that they bite huge chunks of flesh from the arms or legs of their neighbors and fellow slaves and swallow them down. In other words, they're cannibals, they're savages, they're most dreadful, ugly, vile people. So, this was the theory, if you like, behind the persecution of black people in the United States of America after the Civil War and, for the next 100 years. And of course, to some extent or another, it still goes on. So the articulation of the similarity in the skin tones and other features of blacks and Jews may be seen on the one hand as part of a project to denigrate Jews, but it must also be seen as part of the larger narrative of the inferiorization of black, colored, and other colonized people throughout the world. So it's a whole kind of encompassing theory. And the truth is that you have to imagine your own religious and philosophical ideas about Hebrewism with this kind of background in mind, where there's a whole world out there which is theorizing not only that all Jews are blacks, but also that all blacks are in some ways Jews, certainly in terms of behavior, certainly in terms of shared ugliness, certainly in terms of shared color, and certainly in terms of racial origins, which, as we've seen, was supposedly thought to go back to the time of the Hebrews in Egypt and a mingling of the races at that period some 3,500 years ago. So, one of the things then that happens, and I've written a lot about this, is that during the colonial age, and this is also the age of exploration, where Europe expands. The world was pretty small if you go back to the 14th century, the 1300s, not very much the 1400s. Only little bits of the world were known. Europe was it had more or less a good knowledge of the area around the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, the Americas hadn't yet been discovered. There was no knowledge of Japan, very little knowledge of China, hardly any knowledge at all about Africa, some knowledge about India because there were trade links already. But most of the world was absolutely unknown. And during the voyages by the Portuguese, by the Spanish, a little later by the English, the Dutch, the French, the world was gradually brought into a European orbit. And one of the things that happens, which from your point of view I think should be interesting, it's this. Just imagine a missionary turning up, along with one of the first voyages of exploration down the west coast of Africa. And yesterday I was reading a new book which has got to do with the development of the Jewish community of Uganda, which is based in a town called Mbale, on the close to the border with Kenya. And this could act very well as a kind of example of what I'm talking about. So I'm asking you to imagine a not very well educated, white missionary. I should just explain this, that, the kind of people that were taken to work as imperial civil servants and who were sent out to India as district commissioners or to Africa as district commissioners, they were quite well educated and they would have had a good knowledge of the classics and they would have had some knowledge of geography and other sort of modern disciplines. Missionaries, on the other hand, probably not. They would have been literate, no doubt. They would know the Bible very, very well, but they wouldn't know anything about anthropology. They wouldn't know anything about ethnography. They wouldn't know anything about science. They knew the Bible. And so I'm asking you to imagine such a person, maybe a white American, maybe a English or German missionary, and he turns up in some African village, and the Africans in the village are doing stuff. He doesn't really understand, what they're doing. He can't understand the language. He doesn't even know if it is a language. And, they do stuff, let's say, at the new moon, and he's looking at this, and he's, oh my God, what are they doing? Is this a religion? He doesn't really know, what it is. And so he has to make some kind of decision. What is it? Is it them just jumping around and being foolish, or is it actually something important and serious? and gradually kind of realizes that what they're doing is religious. He understands that on the new moon, they have certain ceremonies, or let's say at a certain point of the year, they have ceremonies about the first fruits, or they may have, let's say, ceremonies about circumcision, or they may have ceremonies about what you can eat and what you can't eat, or they may have some kind of ceremony about menstrual periods for women and what women are supposed to do during these periods. And so, it's during this this moment on the colonial frontier that they think, hey, well, you've got all of these things, and all of these things are in the Bible. And so therefore, it must be the case that these people have got some sort of Hebraic quality. So many of the Jewish and Hebraic kind of things which you find in Africa, let's be honest, are not things that were necessarily articulated in Africa as Jewish or Hebraic or biblical things, but they were the same as people noted in the Bible. This led the missionaries to say these people must be originally Jews, and a lot of the ideas about the Tutsis being Jews, or the Igbo being Jews, or the Lemba being Jews, were originally kind of suggested by missionaries who noticed that their habits, their customs, and their beliefs seemed to be similar or identical to the practices described in, let's say, the book of Deuteronomy and other books of the Old Testament. Now, in a way, this created an invention of Jewish populations, but it didn't constitute an invention of the habits that led the missionaries to make this kind of identification. Those things were genuinely there, and we can reasonably ask ourselves how those notions got to different parts of Africa. You might say, well, most religions throughout the world have, similar customs, and it's simply a coincidence. Or you might argue that these ideas trickled down from northern Africa, from, let's say, Egypt, down the Nile Valley, or from the Middle East, down the east coast of Africa, and then they came in up the Zambezi, or something like that. So during this period, African blacks, in vast numbers, from the ugly people, the ugliest of all people, according to the theories of the 18th century, were the so-called Hottentots, and I'll come to them in a minute, but to the Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania, the Yoruba in Nigeria, the Igbo in Nigeria, the Tutsi, the Zulu, the Xhosa, Bassa, Ibibio, Fula, the Baluba, the Khoikhoi, the Shona, Makalanga, Isan, Efik, Baluba, Fon, Fulani, Meru, Nga, Soninke, all of these, Tiv, Yibir, among many others, were regularly constructed, racialized, explained, perceived, and described precisely as Jews, as people with biological Jewish roots, in whose lives ideas and practices, remnants of an ancient Judaism, could still allegedly be made out, in whose languages traces of Hebrew could still allegedly be identified, and in whose veins Jewish blood assuredly flowed. Now, all of these things, all of these vast numbers of African ethnicities, which are explained by missionaries and by colonists and by travelers and by writers as being of Jewish origin, it's on the basis, again, of these racial constructions that we have already seen. So I'm not saying that the customs and the habits of these people were badly described, but I don't think they were. But the idea behind it is essentially racialization, if you see what I mean. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, this idea that, there are Jews all over Africa is generated in a kind of different ways, by your own ancestors and your own ancestors who toiled in the slave farms of the slave states in the 18th and 19th century, were introduced to the Bible, of course. There was a good deal of resistance to it initially, but eventually most slave populations developed a good knowledge of the Bible, and it was easy enough to make a comparison between the backbreaking toil and life that they led with the Israelites who were slaving who were working as slaves in Egypt, that they read about in their few moments of leisure. And so the songs, the so-called Negro spirituals that were developed during this time, they're all about this. It's a kind of, it's a way of seeing yourselves through the prism of the Bible, of pushing yourself into the Hebrew text, perhaps getting some comfort from this idea, this comparison, not least because the slaves in Egypt finally find redemption, and so the hope of African slaves was always to do with redemption. One day we will be redeemed. We will be enfranchised. We will be freed from the terrible bond of slavery. So this is kind of a metaphor. On the one hand, you've got a metaphor developing in the United States and in other slave societies. And at the same time, in Africa, you've got this burgeoning sense that Africans are, in many, many cases, not everybody, but in many, many cases, are actually Jews, partly because of the racial theories that suggested that, and partly because the people concerned genuinely had a lot of practices and religious structures and infrastructures which appeared to the missionaries to suggest a Jewish origin. And those ideas, of course, are still alive and well. And throughout Africa, there are many African societies that look fondly back on their supposed Hebrew origins. I did say I would mention the Hottentots because it's really, really interesting. In the 18th century, the thinkers of the Enlightenment who were trying to understand the world, we shouldn't be too negative about them. It wasn't that they were kind of nasty people, horrible people who were out to put everybody down and be nasty about people. They really wanted to understand the world, and with the voyages of exploration, with new peoples being discovered all the time from a European standpoint, You know, and you have North American Indians, and you have you know, groups from the Pacific Islands, and then Africans, all sorts of people who turn up in Paris and London and all over Europe, and people are absolutely amazed. And at the time, I don't know whether you know this, but they used to have human zoos. They were a great thing in lots of European cities. And so instead of having animals there, they would have they'd build entire African villages, and Kenyans or other Africans would come, and they would sit and do what they normally did at home, and people would come and they would pay and they would look at them and they'd be absolutely intrigued at these very different kinds of lives and very, very different kinds of people. And so one of the groups that was particularly interesting for one reason or another were the Hottentots, who lived in what is today South Africa, and they were the original inhabitants of this area before the Bantu expansion moved into this area. And there was one particular so-called Hottentot woman. She was known as the Hottentot Venus. And so she came finally to Europe. She had the most dreadful life. She was awfully disadvantaged, and she was exploited. And it's a horrible, horrible story. But at the same time, as the Hottentots were being considered to be the ugliest people in the world, and the Hottentots were being exported into these inhuman human zoos. And at the time that poor Sarah Bartman, the Hottentot Venus, was being exploited and abused in Paris, scholars were saying, well, actually, these people are really Jews. And book after book after book at the time is specifically making the point that the world's ugliest people, as they were considered to be, were of Jewish origin. So that concludes the background, if you like, the intellectual background against which we are now going to look at whether there were Jews in Africa, Black Jews, and whether there was any possibility, or whether there is any possibility, that African, in scientific terms, I'm speaking now in scientific terms, among the slave populations that came to the United States, the Caribbean, and everywhere else, mainly during the 18th and early 19th century.
I want to say something real quick, Professor. Family that all is listening, Mr. Parfitt gave us a gift. I just want everybody to know, because me and him had talked a little bit extra. That's why we were late. He decided he wanted to do a full history lesson and give us extra time, because it was just a migration pattern. So I am so grateful for him to come on and do this and add this to the presentation. So this was a blessing for us, family, because this is a very good history lesson. And for those who don't know, he's a professor at Florida International University. So we're sitting in a real history class that's not being distorted and lied to and all that. So I just wanted to let y'all know what was going on before he goes into every detail. So be patient and listen. Please listen. All right, Professor.
So my own story crosses this whole business in a rather remarkable way. So in 1984, one day I was invited, I was teaching, I was professor of Hebrew, University of London in those days. And so I was invited for lunch by somebody in one of the, great London clubs. And the gentleman who invited me said, you know, there are Jews in Ethiopia, and those poor Jews are being poisoned to death, and they're dying in enormous numbers in refugee camps in the Sudan. Here, this is the Sudan, and this is Ethiopia. And at the time, a civil war was raging between the followers, you know, of the emperor. He'd already been killed, deposed, and the communist rebels. And also, it was the time, if you remember, the most terrible famine that's ever hit Ethiopia. Millions of people died. And the Jewish population who live around Lake Tana, you can just see it there, were flooding over into Sudan, and they were in these refugee camps, and apparently they were being poisoned, and they were dying in large numbers. And so the gentleman that invited me to lunch, he said, Parfitt, we need somebody to go there and see what's going on. So off I went a couple of days later, and the plane landed in Khartoum. In Khartoum, I took a bus across the desert, got off here, a place called Gadaref, and I soon saw that really the situation of the refugees was awful. I met the Jewish population, and it did indeed seem that they may have been poisoned because hundreds and hundreds and thousands had died in the camp. There was no suitable food for them. They refused to eat a lot of the food that was available because it was not kosher. So I stumbled over an Israeli effort to rescue the Jewish population and take them up here to Israel. And the Israeli operation was called Operation Moses. And I wrote a book about that. And it was translated into I don't know how many languages. It had quite an impact. And I was invited a few months later to give a lecture down here at the bottom, do you see, Johannesburg, in South Africa. And so, you know, I give my lecture, and it's mainly South African Jews, European Jews. And right at the back of the hall, there were a number of quite shabby looking, you know, African guys wearing Jewish skull caps. They weren't wearing shoes, I remember. They were really poor. And after my talk, I went over and they say, hey, do you know, we're Jews. And I'd never heard of, you know, Jews, black Jews down here in this part of the world at all. You know, it's a hell of a long way from the Ethiopian Jews that we do know about living up in Ethiopia. You've got the whole of Africa between. And, you know, I said, really, I mean, this is not very, I mean, I've never heard about that. And they could tell I didn't really believe them. And so they invited me to go to their village or their villages. And so here we are in Johannesburg, and these guys lived up here somewhere in what then was called Venda. It was a sort of homeland. It's on the border, close to the border with Mozambique. It's quite mountainous and very nice villages with, you know, with grass huts and, you know, one or two other buildings, maybe with corrugated iron, you know, roofs, mainly thatched, very pretty. And I spent there a few days with them, and they showed me the customs and the habits and the circumcision and the rituals and the language, and I thought, my goodness, there is something very Jewish about this. And at that moment, I was just like the missionaries long before me, wasn't I? Seeing that there really were Jewish habits here. And then they told me an amazing story. They said, you know, we have this tradition that once upon a time we came from a place called Senna. And, 1,000 years ago or more, nobody quite knows. And then we left Senna, and we came to Africa, and we rebuilt Senna, and then we came into Central Africa, and then our forefathers broke the Lord's rules, and our forefathers ate mice, and as a result of that, they were scattered all over the place. And now they're to be found in Zimbabwe, South Africa, all over this area, Malawi, Tanzania. And they said, well, you know, this is what we've been told. And it was on that trip that I met the spiritual head of the Lemba people. We'll see an image of him in a minute. And Professor Mativa, who was a professor at the university, and he said to Parfitt, we want you to find Senna. And I said, well, I have no idea where it is. How would I know? He said, well, if you travel, you know, you're English. English people are good at exploring. And if you just ask questions, you know, go to the villages, go to Zimbabwe, travel through Zimbabwe, wherever the Lemba are, you'll find them. And they will tell you where we came from, because we came from village to village. And these people they remember every detail, and it's part of their oral tradition. All you need to do is to go north. So I went back to England, and I went to see my publisher. I told him this amazing story about the people having come from Senna. And he said, yeah, well, it's an incredible tale. Maybe there's some truth in it. I'd like you to write a book. So I got permission from my university to take some months out, and I had an advance for the book, so I had money to travel, and off I set. And so the journey that I did was marked here, you know, with various trips, you know, to one side and the next. And a lot of it was, you know, the initial part of the journey was quite a lot of it was, you know, on train or buses. But once I got here, a lot of it was on foot, going from village to village to village to village to village. And, you know, at night I'd sit down with the elders, we'd drink beer round a campfire, and the old men, not the women were not part of the conversation. They weren't allowed to know the tribal secrets. And the men would tell me, yes, well, it's said that when we came to this village, we came from over there, we went past a mountain, you'll find it, there are white stones, or there are trees on the top of the hill, it's full of, it's full of monkeys, all sorts of, there's a stream with a stone bridge. They gave me a lot of details like this, and so I went to the next village and the next village and the next village, and gradually I crossed over a good deal of Africa, and I sort of finished up round about here, pretty skinny and very suntanned, and I was picking up clues about Senna and their beliefs and their practices all the way, writing every day. So I had a book. And then when I got to about here, no more clues. The whole story kind of just dried up. And I finished the first version of that book. It's called Journey to the Vanished City. Finished up there with me gazing out to sea and wondering where Senna was and wondering if they were Jewish, or not knowing really. And maybe a couple of years later, I was up here. And now I was writing a different book about the Jews of the Yemen. And so the capital of the Yemen is Sana'a there. And I was traveling down here across the coast and then down the valley of the Hadramaut, which is, as you know, mentioned in the Bible. And in Tarim, the holy city of Tarim in the Hadramaut, it's a desert, a vast desert with this valley running through it with the purest water when there was water. And I loved to swim in that river. And I spoke to a holy man there, and I told him about my travels in Africa and how I was looking for Senna and how I was looking for the fabled home of the lemba. And he said, whoa, if you go to the end of the Hadramaut, not many people had ever been there, but if you go to the end, you will find a place which we call Senna. We have this tradition that hundreds of years ago, there were people from Senna who indeed went to Africa somewhere, because at that time the dam that provided irrigation for the people broke and they had no way of sustaining life. They went to the coast, they got on boats, and they went down to the coast of Africa. We've never heard anything of them ever since. We also discovered that the tribal names in this area in the eastern Hadramaut were very, very similar to the tribal names of the lemba. And it then occurred to me, and this was, I was one of the very, very first people to do this. I decided to do a mass DNA project. Now everybody talks about it, right? It's common garden. I guess everybody out there has done a DNA test to see where your ancestors came from. It wasn't available then. And nobody thought of using genetics to look at, tribal history. So we were the first. And so we did a study. I got a lot of people here to look at the surrounding population. Then we went back to Zimbabwe and South Africa. We collected a lot of lemba. We collected a lot in Mozambique and all around. So you would have proper control groups. And eventually, when we got all the data, it went back to the lab in the University of London. And as you know, because it became one of the most famous pieces of research that I was ever involved in, I was on 60 Minutes at the time talking about it, and it was on the front page of the New York Times. It was a mega story for an academic. And so the genetics was clear at the time. And what it showed was that the black population of the lemba living here, and it strung out in these little villages going across Africa, certainly came from the Middle East. They seemed to be a Jewish population which had come from there at some remote time in the past. And another feature of this was that they had a tribe called the Buba, and the Buba was supposed to be the priests of the lemba tribe, and they, in days gone by, had been the owners and the carriers of the so-called Ngoma Lungundu, which I immediately realized had some features in common with the Ark of the Covenant. Now, when we discovered that this Buba clan of priests had exactly the same genetic profile as Jewish priests, and then we discovered that Jewish priests, which is to say people called Cohen or some other priestly name, had got a marker which implied that they had a single ancestor who lived up here somewhere in northern Arabia, Israel, 3,000 years ago, about the same time as Moses. It seemed to completely revolutionize, what we might speculate about the history of the Lemba people. And I then went on to write a book about the Ngoma Lungundu, this object which the Lemba used to carry into battle, which contained sacred objects, which was carried on poles like the Ark of the Covenant by priests, which was never allowed to touch the ground, which non-priests were never allowed to touch. I think maybe you know this story. It's a dramatic and amazing story. And then I was very fortunate. The Ngoma had been lost for a very long time. It was briefly discovered just after the Second World War by a German-Swedish missionary, and then it was lost again, and I found it. And I don't know whether you've ever seen the movie I did on the History Channel about the Ark of the Covenant. That tells you the story of the idea that it was the Ark, and so on, and so forth. It's a very, very exciting moment. So the Lemba then all of a sudden become, world famous. Biology textbooks at this time, just as a matter of routine, used to have a little thing on the Lemba because the DNA was doing something remarkable. On the outside, they were black, but on the inside, through their DNA, they appeared to be completely connected with Caucasian, using that rather silly term, Jews living in Europe. And so the DNA was telling us something that was not really visible. They looked Bantu, but in fact, inside there was something else. And so, these tests were very, very much discussed. And for a number of years, the impact of this piece of research on so many people throughout the world has been incalculable. Every single day something crops up, in my in-tray, either a group in America or a group in, Papua New Guinea or India or somewhere is interested in this idea. They want to have their own DNA tested, or they see in the Lemba genetic story a proof of their own conviction that it's possible to be black and of Jewish origin. So among, for instance, the Igbo in Nigeria, millions and millions and millions of Igbo who believe that they are of Jewish origin. This was grist to their mill. among the Tutsi, they have somewhat different beliefs, but they do believe that they're of Israelite extraction. Many other groups in Côte d'Ivoire, in Cameroon, all over Africa, there are Jewish communities now, black Jewish communities, and they see in the research done on the lemba a proof of their cherished beliefs. So, what can we say, honestly and soberly, with no exaggeration, trying to stay factual and academic? What can we say? Is it possible that Judaism somehow got to Central Africa, and does the genetic evidence support it? I think the answer, the sober and responsible answer, is yes and no. Or rather, the geneticists are still looking at the raw data, which is to say the DNA that we brought back so many years ago. But the science of genetics has changed, and now in a split second, using AI, it's possible to analyze billions and billions and billions of markers, and you can see the whole of the genome very, very clearly, and you can sort of determine, where people came from and when and how, etc. Back in the day, we were just looking at one chromosome, the Y chromosome, but things have moved on. And now, whereas the Y chromosome data is still there, it's accompanied by a vast amount of knowledge from the rest of the genome. And this gives a somewhat different impression. I can't really talk about it anymore because the paper, which I will be a co-contributor to, has not yet been published. So it wouldn't be fair on the people who have toiled to do this research for me to reveal any more than that. However, I think it would not be unfair for me to say that, well, to some extent, the original idea it's not quite as defined, it's not quite as robust, it's not quite as definite, but yes, that Middle East genes got into Central Africa, no question, and almost certainly those Middle East genes were derived from traders who traded in the Indian Ocean, going from the Middle East down the east coast of Africa, probably, to the fabled city, one of the great African cities of antiquity, which I don't think you probably know much about, but is worth looking into, called Sofala, a beautiful, beautiful African city on the east coast of Africa, overlooking the Indian Ocean. And so, you have that. The other thing that we have, and here we're not talking about myth, we're not talking about fanciful ideas. I want to stay sober and academic. If there are many books written by Igbo scholars in Nigeria, and they create whole histories of how the lost tribes of Israel somehow got to Nigeria at some point in the past. It may be true. I'm not saying it's not true, but we don't have any evidence for that. And me, as an Oxford-trained historian, I can only work within facts. And either a totally reliable oral tradition, an early oral tradition, that's fine by me. But in this particular case, I don't quite have it. And so I cannot really lend my name to those sort of big theories of great migrations of Jews from Egypt or from the Middle East or from Assyrian penetration, any of these ideas which I know that you know all about. But staying within what I do have evidence, clear evidence for, we could look at Senegal. Now, I know that you know where Senegal is. I'm afraid, oh yes, well, if we look at this map here, do you see? So you've got this huge kind of bulge in the African continent. The Senegal is about here, and the Senegal River pretty much marks the divide between Arab populations here and Bantu populations further down. And in the 15th century, following the the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and from Portugal, quite a number of Jews fled and settled among African populations on this coast down here. Black Africans, well received, and they formed villages. There's a little area here called La Petite Côte, the small coast, so-called, in Senegal. And we know that in the 1600s, there were a number of these villages where Judaism was being practiced. The Jews by this time were black. They'd intermarried with African women. And there were little villages like that, probably small villages, small enclaves, right down the west coast of Africa, about which not that much are known. Now, back in about, I should think about 10 years ago, I wrote a book which was called Black Jews in Africa and the Americas, and it was published by Harvard University Press. I'd given some lectures at Harvard University on this subject, and I detailed everything I knew, obviously, in the book about black Jews, and it was a very interesting thing for me to do. I first started working on the subject of black Jews in Africa in the previous book. It was called The Myth of the Lost Tribes of Israel. There was a chapter in that book which was published in 2002, which was quite a detailed chapter about the development of Judaism in Africa. Subsequently, other books emerged. I believe you mentioned Dr. Bruder, who was a PhD student of mine, who wrote a book. I subsequently developed my original idea from the Lost Tribes of Israel in the lectures for Harvard University, and then I wrote published the lectures. Anyway, I mentioned all of the places where I knew, Jews had been imagined to live or did live, and it was quite well received. The book did reasonably well, and a few years later, I was reading a German book which had been written in the middle of the 18th century. And to my astonishment, it spoke about a community of black Jews who lived in the kingdom of Loango. Now, at the time, I admit, I'd never heard of Loango, never heard of its black Jews. I felt absolutely furious that my Harvard book had come out and I hadn't mentioned this community in any way. And it was the discovery of this community that led me to write my next book, which was called Hybrid Hate. Now let's just have a look at where it kind of is. So this here is the Luango coast. It's not very clear, but I think this is the Congo River. Is the deepest river in the world, by the way. It's an immense river. And Gabon is now the country which is to the north of it. And Luango is here. This image on the right is a map that was produced in the 17th century, describing this pre-colonial city. And as you can see, it's got a wall, it's organized, and it's got dwellings, it's quite civilized looking, it's got a palace in the middle. And this is entirely how it was. It was a very well, organized coastal kingdom with good trade relations with surrounding states. They brought copper and various other, minerals from the interior, and they sold them on the coast to traders. They were also, of course, involved in the slave trade. They would grab slaves somewhere up here near the rainforests and bring them to the coast and sell them off. And so what I discovered then was that on this coast, this Luango coast, there was a whole community of black Jews. Never heard of it. And so, of course, I then started to do some research. I found out quite a lot about them, and the probability is that this Jewish community was like the black Jewish community in Senegal. So they probably, can't be sure, 100% sure, but they probably arrived there in the early 16th century, in the 1500s. But, my friends, there's one little fact not many people know, that on the very, very first map, which was produced earlier in the middle of the 15th century, there was a spot here which was called the Gulf of the Jews, the Gulf of the Jews. And on one of the first globes ever created, which is called the Earth Apple in the 1400s, on that Earth Apple, there is, it's marked the Bay of the Jews. So it could be that there was a Jewish community there, right at the beginning of Western exploration of the African coast. Now that's interesting. Anyway, the probability is, the strong probability is, that this community was originally from, originated with Jews coming down from Portugal and Spain, but they were there. We've got say they left then in 1492, right? And then we've got the 1500s, that's one century. We've got the 1600s, that's another century. We've got the 1700s and so on. There's many, many hundreds of years until we get to the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, when a German anthropological expedition went to the Luango coast and discovered them and described them. And they were still doing some things which were considered to be Jewish. They had Jewish-style graves, and there was some kind of weird writing, and people at the time thought it might have been Hebrew. Lots of things like that. They didn't speak on the Sabbath. They kept the Shabbat, the Sabbath, and apparently. And so, we have this. So, this is really interesting. This then, in terms of what we know about Jews in Africa is, this is fact, what we know about the lemba, not quite in the rather exaggerated way that we considered 25 years ago, but still, there is something there that is kind of fact. But let me finish with this thought. None of this really matters at all. That's the truth. Throughout the world, there are currently some 15 million Jews that we know to be Jews. We know by DNA, we know by custom, we know by history, we know by archaeology who they are. And half of them live in Israel, and approximately the other half, I guess, lives in the United States and Europe, for the main part. A few in Australia and various other places. So that's 15 million. But there are hundreds of millions of people who believe that they're Jews, who practice Judaism, who learn Hebrew, who have their own narratives, which are not the same as the narratives of the 15 million Jews, but they're just as important, and they're just as sacred, and they're just as meaningful. And many of these narratives, and many of this vast population of other Jews, new Jews, neo-Jews, are to be found in America. Many are to be found in Africa. Many are to be found in Pakistan, would you believe? Many are to be found in South America, Central America. Many are to be found in Florida, just up the road from me. And that's the new reality. And it's not interesting, to spend too much time looking at distant history. I mean, I know that's what I do, but I'm saying it's not entirely relevant in terms of lived religious sentiment, lived identity practices. Do you see what I mean? And there's a great deal of dignity to be found in all human narratives. And in their way, they're simply as authentic as any other. And of course, if there is some historical nugget that you can attach yourself to, that's fine. But all religions throughout the world and throughout history, throughout time, throughout space, have also always created their own useful historical narratives, and historical narratives which are not so useful tend to be forgotten about. So I hope I'm finishing on a reasonably kind of optimistic and hopeful note. And I don't know really whether this is going to be of any use to you. I hope so. And I would recommend you to have a look at that last book of mine, Hybrid Hate, because I think that it's a very, very good way of understanding the overlap between Jews and Black people. And it's also a very good way, I think, of understanding the development of anti-Black racism, as well as the scourge of anti-Semitism. And of course, at the moment, in America, we're living through a time where both anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism are particularly and painfully prominent. So thank you very much for listening, and I've enjoyed speaking to you today.
Oh wow, awesome, awesome. Just want to say, I do have that book. Well, I don't have it in my possession. I did read the book. I actually sent that book to a brother of mine as well. Um, it's a great book. If y'all haven't got it, Hybrid Hate, you can get it off of Amazon too, family. And the rest of his books, you just put his name in, and all his books should still be on Amazon. Um, Before we let you go, Professor, I just want to ask a question again. When I asked you before we started about just the limber with that chant of the poem when they were saying white, and you were saying that you can explain. Can you just shortly, briefly touch bases on that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. Let me start just by saying something about the Ethiopian Jews. Now, I'm sure you know something about the Ethiopian Jews.
Right.
Most now live in Israel. And by American standards of, color classification, people would say they're black. However, if you would speak to them and say, what color are you? They would use an Amharic term, which might mean red or some other color, white. And so the term black for them, they would not use that for themselves because that word would mean slave. Now, when we come to the lemba and they say that we are the white men that came from Senna, they don't mean white in that sense. It may be a lighter color than the very black people who lived in Central Africa at that time. And so the idea was that they came from the coast. And if you look at the East African coast, the color of East Africans is significantly lighter than the color of some of the populations in the interior. So there's also the possibility that it doesn't really mean white at all, and that it means something like stranger. So there's a bit of a question mark over that. But it certainly is not the case that anybody thought that they were, white men, like I'm a white man, so to speak, who came into Africa at some distant point. That's not what they're saying.
Yeah, I'm glad you made clarity on that. I didn't agree with it. Like I told you, I spoke with a guy named Jacob Israel on Facebook, and he said that's what you were insinuating when you made that when you did that presentation in TED Talk, and I knew something was wrong with that, and I just had to ask you that. But again, I thank you so much for coming. I thank you for the presentation, giving us more than what I actually asked for. It was a real learning experience, especially history. A lot of distorted stuff that they hid history. So yeah, it was a blessing. I'm pretty sure the people in the chat liked it. I'm pretty sure a lot of people will come back and watch it. Everybody's scattering around because we got a lot of storms coming up this way. Where I'm at in Virginia in the Northeast area. So a lot of people weren't on today live watching. But definitely.
Yeah, try to keep warm.
Yeah, it's getting cold too. And I wish, I always said, one day, I'm hoping one day you have some online classes, man. I can't move back to Florida until I retire. So I lived in Florida for years. So I miss the state tax and all that stuff they got going on in Florida. No car inspection, all that. But definitely a blessing, family. Y'all definitely hit the like button, share the video. And Professor, I appreciate you. Do you have anything? Oh yeah, real quick, the article. Where can we find the article once it comes out, or whatever the case may be?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of books out there by now. Over the last 20 years, we've produced a lot of things. One person I would recommend that you look at is I think he's the finest scholar working on the stuff. Is Nathan DeVere.
Nathan DeVere. How do you spell his last name?
Devir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nathan DeVere. Okay.
And, he's at the University of Utah. He's not a Mormon. He just happens to be a professor there.
Mm-hmm.
And he served in the Israeli forces, and he's traveled very widely in Africa. And I mean, the stuff he does is very academic. It's not an easy read, but for those of you who really want to get deeply into this, he's very good. And you know, he totally believes in the idea of African Jews, on the grounds, and so do I. You know, if somebody is if somebody's in a synagogue and somebody says he's a Jew, and somebody's learning Hebrew, and somebody's praying in Hebrew, and somebody's living a Jewish life, I mean, for me, these people are Jews. You know, there's no doubt about that. And the definitions of things are changing all the time. So by that criterion, there are millions of Jews in Africa, black Jews in Africa, and Nathan DeVere's done some great work understanding the phenomenon and understanding these millions and millions and millions of people. I didn't really answer the question. I'm happy to do it if you want me just to say another couple of words.
Yes.
About the likelihood or the possibility of your direct ancestors who came on the Middle Passage being Jewish. And it's one of those things, isn't it? The evidence for that has proved elusive. We know that Muslims came because there were certain cases when they were literate, the slaves were literate, and they wrote something down in Arabic. We know about that. We don't have any example of any Jews working as slaves in the United States writing anything in Hebrew. There's no evidence. There've been a few red herrings, you know, stuff written on the pews of Baptist chapels that some people thought were Hebrew, written a very long time ago. But it's not clear that it's really Hebrew. And you know, it's the truth is that by the time slavery started to be big business, the Jewish communities of the coast were probably assimilated for the most part, and they were no longer sort of maintaining Judaism. Now, it's entirely possible that that members of these small communities in Luangwa or in further north were Jewish. It's possible, but we don't have any hard and fast historical evidence for that at this time. We have to keep digging. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, and you have a blessed day, and enjoy that warm weather down there.
It's going to be very, very cold, just above freezing tomorrow.
Wow.
It's the coldest it's been in Florida since 1986.
Oh, wow. All right. Blessings. Yep. All right, family. Definitely want to thank everybody for coming in. Y'all heard it here first. You know, the history, language, culture, customs, migration patterns. You heard him clearly say all Jews were black, and that Hybrid Hate book, it talks about a lot of biased scholars that's trying to, hide this stuff from us, man. It just grieves my spirit, but we don't need to. We don't. The scriptures is definitely 100, but we always run to Deuteronomy 28:68, but it's so many historical books of scholars. He just gave out sources of them in the 1800s saying we were the people, the original Jews, and all that with our customs. And if y'all heard Remy talk about, the oral traditions were our dietary laws and all that stuff. We've been doing this from the original Moses and everybody else. So, this was very powerful for me. I hope that people sat through and listened. I hope people learned from this. One person came in and act like their ancestors was the only person that was enslaved. You wasn't there physically, so if your people went through it, our people went through it too. That's how we got over here in America. They dropped us off in Brazil, all those other islands by the sea. So it wasn't just America. So you ain't the only people. We over here, our people got dealt with too. So again, family, love this, man. Love y'all. Edith Bruder he recommended. That's the one I supposed to have last week, but she postponed. Pray that I can get her on because she's going to talk about some other Jews. See, we ain't. It ain't just Igbo and lemba. We all over the place, And she's going to talk about. Hopefully, if we can get her back on, she's going to talk about some other Jews in Mali, and Timbuktu, and all that. So keep us in prayer, family, that we can continue to do these interviews, continue to grow this channel. If y'all haven't shared the video, share it with your family. Our family need to hear this history. Share it with our family, man, our Christian family that don't believe that we the Israelites. He just showed a lot of historical information. So please share the video. Share the video. All right, family. Everybody have a blessed Shabbat. I'll see y'all next week. Yahweh's will. And it's all love. Shabbat Shalom. Shalom. Shabbat. Holla at y'all.
Y'all the main ones I'm watching on my throne. Created everything, but I called you my own. That land I gave you, put my name on it, my home. Yeah, that's my home. Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. I made a promise, can't nobody take it. I chose to put you above all the nations. Out of your graves, I chose to awaken. We made a covenant, don't you forsake it. Come get protected while they going crazy. Israel, my firstborn, my baby. Israel, my firstborn, my baby. I woke you up in your land of captivity. I do not change, I want you to remember me. Laws and commandments, I gave you the remedy. Go read the testimonies for your memory. I sent them prophets, but you wasn't hearing me. I come to you if you really come near to me. I heard your cry, now it's time to take it to me. I know what got you from all of your enemies. Who you know open the sea. Them waters was bitter, but I made it sweet. In case you ain't know how to swim, I'm your protector, so I made you walk on your feet. This a reminder you married to me. I just want you to be all I called you to be. They called you niggas, but I made you priests. I'm about to give you back everything. I'm sending plagues for you. I'm sending boys, drying up rivers. I leave them dead for you. Tell Pharaoh, let my people go. You heard what I said for you. Tell Pharaoh, let my people go. You heard what I said for you. For you. You only ever known. Y'all the main ones I'm watching on my throne. Created everything, but I called you my own. That land I gave you, put my name on it, my home. Yeah, that's my home. Israel, I'm the reason you in captivity. We made a covenant. and you ain't remember me. You broke the covenant, I sent your enemy. Get out my lane since you wasn't fearing me. I'm the reason they put you in chains. I'm the reason they switched up your name. I'm the reason why you in the hood. I'm the reason of all your pain. I'm sending floors fast daily. Think I don't love you. Y'all my babies. Gave my son. Must be crazy. Come out that system, come out of that lady. They got that military, it would not phase me. It would not move me. It would not graze me. Remember Egypt. I did all that for my people. You only ever know. Y'all the main ones I'm watching on my throne. Created everything, but I called you my own. That land I gave you, put my name on it, my home. Yeah, that's my home. You only ever know. Y'all the main ones I'm watching on my throne. Created everything, but I called you my own. That land I gave you, put my name on it, my home. Yeah, that's my home. Israel,